Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Bruno and I'm the Deputy Director of the Salt Lake City Council staff, and in that role most of my job relates to the budget. I've worked for the city since 2004, so I've seen it through some interesting growing and shrinking and ups and downs, and hopefully we can answer some questions you have tonight. The goal of this is just to give a sort of baseline orientation of the budget so that as we go into the budget season, which for us is May and June because we're on a fiscal year, you know what to look for when you're tuning in, hopefully, to our budget briefings during May when we get the mayor's recommended budget for the next fiscal year. So let's see. So the thing I always like to say is that the budget is really the showing, like the city shows their priorities through their budget. I think you do it in your personal life too, right? Whatever's important to you is what you end up spending your money on, whether you mean to or not. And so the council members keep that in mind as they're going through the budget and think about what is their priority and are we spending money in line with our priorities. The budget matters, and I'm biased because I'm a budget analyst, but I think the budget matters because it drives everything the city does. You can have all the great master plan documents in the world, you can have all the wonderful, renderings of what parks might look like, but unless they have money behind them, unless there's money attached to those plans never quite come to fruition. So the budget is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of that. It's also a huge value of the Salt Lake City Council that these discussions be public and transparent, which is not always the case with different governmental entities. And so I think that that's a unique thing that Salt Lake City has that I think is important to their priorities. So just to give a sense of how our budget works, a lot of people think of the city budget as sort of one monolith. And in a way it is. It's just under $2 billion, which is a lot of money. But within that $2 billion, there are silos where different funds can't be commingled with each other. They're all equally important because they serve different functions. But let's take the airport, for example. I don't know if you guys have traveled through the airport, but that is actually our biggest budget within the city. And it's fluctuated as that construction project has kind of come to a close or is coming to a close. And so now it's about $500 million, which is still a lot of money. But it actually is more than the general fund, which is where most of the city services that you'd see as a constituent day-to-day go. But because the airport is technically a department of the city council thinks about the airport budget just as closely as they think about the budget for the planning department. And so that's another briefing where the airport comes in and explains how every single one of those dollars are spent so that the council can review if that's in line with the city's priorities. But what's important to know about that silo is that we, the city, can't balance the general fund on any of these other silos, right? So let's say the airport is making a lot of money from airlines or the federal government is giving a lot of grants to the airport fund. There are legal restrictions that don't allow us to sort of commingle those funds. The same is true for public utilities. So you'll hear about, rate increases and things like that. And that all gets factored into how each of those silos put together their budgets. But those all come together to make one Salt Lake City budget. This is approved by the council after deliberations in May and June. State law requires that we approve all of these budgets by June 30th. Which sounds like a long time, but it actually goes really fast, especially when you're thinking about the quantity of information that the council is trying to absorb. And we'll go a little bit more into the timeline of the budget process later, and you'll understand because of our form of government, the mayor and her administration have until the first Tuesday in May to play with the budget and put it together in a balanced form. And then the council has from that first Tuesday in May until mid-June essentially to rework it or adopt it as she proposed. This is another way to look at it. This is, like I was saying here, the airport fund making up the large majority of our city budget. There are a couple of unique funds in Salt Lake City that are not technically enterprise funds, but are unique enough that I thought we might want to pull them out to talk about a little bit, especially because they've been in the news. They might be in the news a little bit in the coming months. The library fund. is the policy of the library, the policies of the library, the management of the books and collection and things like that are set by the library board, which is a separate board from the Salt Lake City Council. But the tax rate for the library and the budget for the library is approved by the City Council. So if there are any tax proposals, that has to be approved by the local elected officials, which are the mayor and Salt Lake City Council. But the purpose of that is to keep the sort of book censorship, which sometimes comes into play, right, from elected officials, from getting into the library space. So we try to keep that very separate, although the discussions about the dollars and cents and the impact on property taxpayers is definitely a part of the council's deliberations. And then the RDA, the redevelopment agency, is another separate legal entity, although it's more like a traditional city department. The unique thing about the RDA, though, is that it has its own direct funding source. So its direct funding source is property tax increment. So different project areas were drawn over the course of the last 20 years-ish at different times. And as property tax values have grown in those areas, that money funds the activities of the RDA. And the theory is that, let's see, let me go to this next slide here. So this shows sort of how growth works in RDA areas. And that base, that green area, continues to flow to the taxing entities that would have otherwise gotten that money. So school district, county, mosquito abatement district, things like that. But the theory is that as the RDA invests in projects in those areas, the growing property tax value will eventually benefit all those taxing entities. So once the project area expires, those taxing entities will get the benefit. And then, of course, the citizens get the benefit from the enhanced development. Obviously, over the years, over the decades, RDAs have been used in good and bad ways. And I think that our RDA has not taken that sort of 1960s approach of like eliminating blight, that kind of thing. And our RDA is much more about building communities and investing in communities. So that's that. Expenses. So this is how, I'm going to focus mostly on the general fund as it relates to revenues and expenses, just because this would be a half-hour-long presentation if I went through all the funds. Expenses, the largest department, this is sort of like a joke I like to make, the largest department in our city is non-departmental. So the largest department is the non-department, which is so bureaucratic. It's funny, I feel like it's a Parks and Rec episode or something, but it's where a lot of our citywide expenses live. So capital improvement projects live there, bond payments live there. So if we've issued a bond, that lives there. If we're paying other, what we call internal service funds, so like our fleet fund that manages our cars and police cars and things like that, that all lives there. So that's our largest department. That's just over $110 million. And then the police department is second behind that, which is just over $100 million. And our police department has grown in the last few years, but it also has grown in the sense of we now have a civilian response team that technically live within the police department budget, as well as social worker program that lives in the police department budget. So I guess that's another thing I would encourage anyone who's interested in diving a little deeper into the city budget is oftentimes there's more to the story than just the title of the department. And we try to make that pretty clear in our staff reports. You'll see each department will have a staff report written for it, and those are great resources if you want to understand sort of how that pie slice is actually spent on the ground. One interesting thing about cities, and I think this is true for most governments, is that most of our expenses are people related, so employee related. So it's a little different when we are thinking about balancing the budget than if our budget was entirely, project related, right? Where you can always put off a project if you can't afford it. But if you've hired a police officer, for example, it's hard and difficult, not to say it's never happened before, but it's hard to say, sorry, police officer, we need to lay you off because we need to cut the budget. So this is one way where each year when the mayor's office endeavors on balancing the budget, I think this is where they have the biggest challenge, is because most of the expenses are sort of not necessarily already spoken for, but it is difficult when you're dealing with people who are already in a position, right? People who are doing a great job and who are trying really hard. So that is just one of the the things to consider. In terms of revenues, we have, I like to say, things we can control and things we can't control, and things that are volatile and things that are stable. So most of our revenue is either property tax, sales tax, franchise tax, or fees. Property tax, sales tax, and franchise tax are kind of the biggest ones, and they're all governed by state law in one way or another. But we have the most flexibility as it relates to property taxes. So state law allows the city to raise property taxes according to a certain, process. So if the city is willing to go through that process, we're allowed to raise property taxes. Sales taxes, we cannot raise unless the state says, here, city, you are allowed to raise taxes by this percentage. So the city is capped in terms of what we can charge in terms of sales tax. This is also interesting if you've ever lived in other cities. Some cities are able to raise their sales taxes by themselves or with the approval of voters. Other cities have income tax as part of their budget. We do not. So frequently when people are talking about economic development projects bringing a ton of jobs. Jobs are great, of course, for the community and for the citizens. But in terms of dollars and cents, those jobs don't necessarily bring real dollars to the city budget unless those people are going out and spending money in the city, which they likely would. But so the last time the state authorized the city to increase sales tax was in 2018. And I don't know if any of you followed along with, we dubbed it Funding Our Future. And the city was very intentional about certain areas to focus on with that 0.5% sales tax increase. You may have read in the paper that the state has also authorized the city to consider increasing sales tax by another 0.5% for the purpose of a downtown revitalization zone. So that may be coming again. But that's only an option because the state allowed it to be an option, and the state gets to determine the purpose. So we're a lot more limited than other cities in the country are in terms of what we can decide to do with that particular money. The other thing to know about sales tax compared to property tax is that it's significantly more volatile. So I was a budget analyst for the council in 2008 and 9 when the recession, that particular recession hit, and that line item dropped almost $30 million in 1 year, which in the middle of a budget year is a big hit for our budget, and it meant a lot of creative thinking, and employees took a pay cut, and it was not ideal for anyone, but we survived it. And I think the lessons that we've learned is that the city, in fact, the Salt Lake City, was grateful that our property tax was kind of a more balanced part of our pie than some other cities. Some other cities had much lower property taxes because they relied more heavily on sales taxes. They wooed the Walmart to come to their city, or they wooed the Costco to come to their city. And that works when sales are great, but when sales start dropping and you have no other option to fill your budget, then property tax is your only option. So we were able to cobble together a plan mid-year that did not mean laying off anyone. It did mean some pain, but even though that sales tax was so volatile. Thankfully, I think some of us were unsure what COVID would mean for our economy, and we're being very cautious about budgeting for our sales tax in the years after COVID. Thankfully, of course we knock on wood, our sales tax has not dropped since COVID, and in fact it's grown. And so I think that we're all still being cautiously optimistic that will be a continued trend, but that's just something we always watch for. Is the more we will rely on sales tax, like the bigger that piece of the pie sales tax becomes, budget analysts get a little worried, because that means that we're putting more of our budget balancing hopes on a pretty unstable source. So this is just a breakdown of the current Salt Lake County sales tax rate. So it goes through, I think we use this to illustrate that, and I think this is something that a lot of people don't realize until they actually look at the breakdown of the sales tax, is most of the sales tax goes to the state. And very little goes to the city. So we're often, the city is often like the face of sales tax, because I think you think of your local government as the people who are charging the taxes, and they are, but I think it's good to think about the other places that sales taxes are going, which are all very valid places, and some of them were authorized by voters, right? But it's just important. So the state gets about 63% of every dollar. The city general, so the 1% city general sales tax is about 13% of every dollar. Funding Our Future, that one that I mentioned that the state authorized recently, is about 6%. UTA gets about 10%. The county gets about 3%. And then there's another county transportation option that is another 3%. And then the county ZAP, which is Zoo, Arts, and Parks, and that was approved by voters several years ago, I believe, and that's another 1% of that dollar. So that's how your sales tax is split out. Truth in taxation, this is hopefully where I don't lose everyone, but sometimes I do. This is a unique concept to Utah. Property taxes are just a funny thing, and I don't think any state has really cracked the code of how to protect people who have been in their properties for a very, very long time and not having them be priced out of their homes. So for example, in California, there was a thing called Prop 13 that froze property taxes in 1974. And if you lived in your house before that, you don't pay any more property taxes except for like a small percentage escalator. That has essentially priced out any new homeowner since like the 80s. And because the cities are trying to make up for the lost revenue from those, artificially held property values. And so what Utah decided to do, and I believe this was in the early 90s, was implement something called truth in taxation, where the government is essentially guaranteed the same amount of money every year, regardless of what your property value does. So if your house is worth $200,000 today and next year it's worth $300,000, the rate of your property tax for the city would automatically be adjusted down so that the city would receive the same amount of money that next year that they received the previous year. It also works the other way, where if the value of your house goes down, which happened in 2008, the rate floats up so that the city gets the same amount of money. I think that what's frustrating about this concept is that it almost never, as a property owner, it almost never feels like you're paying the same amount of money. It almost feels like you're paying more every year. And I think that that's where it is really good for everyone to get really used to looking at their property tax bill and every single line item on the property tax bill so that you understand which entities are proposing increases. Frequently, it's one or two entities that are proposing increases, and so it looks like the overall bill is increasing, and it might be, but from a legal standpoint, this is the system we operate under, and so the city budget does not benefit when someone's house value is increased from $250,000 to $350,000. The exception to that, The exception to that is new development. So let's say all of these blue arrows are what's factored into our baseline property tax budget. And that's that thing I was just talking about of the rate will automatically adjust up or down depending on the value so that the city gets the same amount of money. The exception to that is new development. So let's say we have a blank piece of property, or let's say we have a house, and that house is demolished and an office building is built in its place. The state law recognizes that the city needs more funding to service the people who are occupying that office building, or let's say an apartment building, because there are more people. In theory, they're having more heart attacks, they're calling the police more often, they're driving on the street and wearing the street out. And so the state allows the city this concept called new growth, and we don't get to decide what it is. The state uses information from the county assessor to tell us how much we can account for in new growth. And oftentimes it's a little bit less than we would have calculated on our own, just based on the cranes and the building permits that we're issuing. But it's better than nothing, and it helps the city keep pace with growth. And so that, I think the thing that's especially important to think about as an existing city resident is if we weren't allowed that new growth, existing city residents we would rely on existing city residents to pay more property taxes to pay for those services for those new city residents, city workers, whatever. So that allows us our new baseline, which in theory is paid for by that new growth. So this is just another way of talking about what I talked about earlier, in that our portion of the property tax bill is not the full pie. The school district is actually probably the larger portion of the pie in Salt Lake City. The statewide average, the schools are much more of the property tax bill. So again, get to know your property tax bill, look at the dollars that are going to each entity. The term entity means, school district, which is governed by an elected board, county, which is governed by an elected board, those kinds of things. And so the county assessor has that information, and has the information to contact each of those entities, where if you see that the school district levy is going up and you have questions about it, as much as information as we try to get on the school district's budget, the city doesn't have anything to do with it. That doesn't have anything to do with the decisions that were put into it, things like that. So that's why it's good to know which entity you're interested in understanding more about. This slide talks about one-time money versus ongoing money. This is a little bit more in the weeds, but it's interesting to think about in the sense of, if you think, well, why couldn't the city avoid a property tax increase, because didn't you just sell that big piece of land? And so what the city tries to do, and what is best budget practices, is to pay for ongoing needs with ongoing money. Property taxes are ongoing, sales taxes are ongoing. The sale of a property or a building permit for a very uniquely large development, like for example the airport, is not ongoing money. We're not going to have an airport project every year to pay for things in the future. And so what the city tries to do is line up, we have a lot of one-time expenses, one-time needs, and so we'll try to pay for those one-time needs with that one-time kind of money. But we try to line up all of our ongoing expenses with our ongoing needs. It's just like in your personal budget, you wouldn't want to make sure that you can pay for your mortgage with, selling off things on eBay or whatever, right? You'd want to make sure that you have ongoing money coming in to cover your ongoing needs. And maybe the one-time expenses are for the one-time needs, like a trip or something like that. These are the council's priorities for fiscal year 25. And the administration is not required to consider the council's priorities as they're putting together their budget, but it sure helps if they understand where the council's coming from, so that during the May and June discussions, we're not coming from totally different places. The priorities for this year are addressing the city's backlog of maintenance projects, assessing the city's response teams and homeless services. So after 2020, the city initiated a number of different response models in various departments, and I think there's an interest in reevaluating whether it makes sense to have them located in many different departments, or if there's an opportunity to consolidate. Managing the city's rainy day fund, city employee pay, and community outreach and engagement. So those are the key priorities for this year. And so what we'll do as council budget staff is, anytime we get a proposal from the administration, we'll highlight, which of these priorities does this accomplish? Does it accomplish any of the priorities? Are there ways to adjust the department budget so that it could meet those budget priorities? And so that's how we evaluate that. And then this is into that timeline I was talking about. So where we are right now is just before the submit circle. So the administration, and I can tell you because we work alongside them, the administrative staff have been working really hard. All of the departments, the finance department, the mayor's office, have been working hard to put together all of their needs and evaluating which of those needs essentially make the cut. Which of those needs can the city afford? Which of those needs are important from the mayor's perspective as her, budget priorities as the elected official? And so it's a little bit of a black box, because it's their legal right to put together a budget without the council's involvement until that first Tuesday in May. So we actually aren't aware of what the budget, I mean, we're generally aware of things that the mayor is interested in, but we're not aware of what will be in her budget that's presented to the council on Tuesday. So it's always kind of like a surprise when we finally get it on that first Tuesday in May. And then starting that first Tuesday in May, it's a mad dash through May and June, so that's for the council and the public to understand every department, especially the bigger departments like the police department, like the fire department, to make sure that the council is either comfortable with what the mayor proposed, or if they have questions about what the mayor proposed, to say, you know, I'm okay approving that money as long as I understand that it's going to achieve X, Y, or Z goal. And so that's really the purpose of the council's discussions in May and June. And then the council makes their deliberations final. Usually around mid-June, they adopt the budget. And then if there is a tax increase as part of the budget, that sets off a series of requirements by state law to have a truth in taxation hearing in August, where there is a public hearing. The public is welcome to come and say why we should not have a tax increase. And then the council can either reconsider the budget. Some councils have done that, or adopt the budget anyway. So there's a little bit of an overlap because our fiscal year starts on July 1, and the truth and taxation hearing is not until mid-August, but the state has basically said that we have a way to figure that out if the council ends up not doing a tax increase. So anyway, that was a lot of information. Sorry. Happy to go back to any slides if you guys have any questions, or any questions.
Is there a cap for the amount that can be made by the mayor from the small group to the bigger group, or is that just an infinite amount that they can pull from?
There is a cap established by state law for the property tax rate. So the property tax rate cannot exceed a certain amount. The exact number is escaping me because it's like 6 decimals. We're only about halfway there in terms of where our current rate is. So I would say that there's a little bit of headroom for the mayor to grow the budget, but obviously there's the political consequence of proposing a property tax increase. So there's not necessarily a yearly cap, but there is a maximum rate allowed for both the city and the library. And I guess the other variable is sales tax. So if the mayor believes, and usually we'll have economists to consult with, that let's say she believes that sales tax will grow by 20% next year. She could technically propose that in a budget. I think the council would likely not accept that forecast and say, no, we will likely see closer to 5 to 10% sales tax growth. So there's a little bit of a back and forth once you get to the total amount. Does that make sense? Do you have a follow-up?
So you don't know the total, but it's just half of what can be right now available, and they can just increase that to the upper, all the way up to the top, but you don't know the number?
I think, okay, so putting me on this, I think it's like 0.00007, and I can look it up if you give me a minute with my laptop. But when we looked at it last year, we were at about half. So meaning our current property tax rate was at about half of the max, because someone asked last year what our max was, and it was significantly higher, and everyone was like, well, we would never do that. So the cap that's allowed by state law, I think, was established so long ago that it probably is less relevant now. I think the more relevant cap is probably what the political willingness is to defend what are you spending that money on? What do you need that money for? That kind of thing.
So I think I've gotten a couple of emails recently about budget amendments to the 2024 budget. How does that work after a budget is already in place?
That's a great question. By law, the mayor is allowed to request amendments to the budget. So we have to have our budget adopted by the end of June. It starts the fiscal year July 1. I think budget amendments are intended so that if we have a windstorm, for example, or an earthquake, we can adjust the budget to respond to those things. Also, in my time here, we've had a crazy storm year, and the salt budget wasn't enough, to keep pace with the snow plowing. I think that there are also now, though, ideas that departments hear from constituents or urgent community needs that come up that might not be in the emergency category, but might be in the urgent category, like a playground that needs repair because some kid got hurt. So those are the kinds of things that we tend to amend the budget for. And it has its own process. So we get a transmittal, we have a public hearing, a public discussion on it, and then a public hearing on it, and then the council adopts it, and then it officially amends the budget. So by the end of fiscal year 2024, the budget, the actual budget will be a little different than what was adopted for the fiscal year 2024 budget process. So if the budget is something you're interested in, definitely stay in tune with all the budget amendments, because frequently it's really boring things like I was saying, like salt budgets, things like that. But other times there are really important and urgent, unexpected community needs that's how they're addressing. So homelessness is often one. So we amended the budget a couple months ago to increase the amount of cleaning in the downtown for homeless encampment cleanups, because the current budget was running out and the council didn't want to say, just stop cleaning. So it's intended for that purpose.
Thanks, that was all very helpful. And I don't know if you can answer this, but I know during COVID, millions came in, not just to Salt Lake, but municipalities across the country from the feds. And everybody had to scramble, what are we going to do with this money? And I don't know what it was 2 years ago, many new positions were created for it. So I don't know if that falls under, and from my understanding was they extended it out several years that it could be spent, but is there a process in place that, and I don't know if that falls under a structural deficit, that as soon as that COVID money's gone, there's 50 or 100 or I don't know how many positions that were funded by that will now have to be funded through general fund or other sources?
That's a great observation, and Salt Lake City received about 90 million, maybe just a little more than 90 million. The city used most of it to fill first responder pay, so existing positions in the police and fire department. So it did help us balance the budget in those years, especially that first year when we really weren't sure what was going to go on with sales tax. There were a few positions that were funded with it. I think Salt Lake City was very deliberate and conservative, frankly, with adding positions with that money. And in fact, there were a few positions that were added with that money that first year we had the COVID dollars that we ended up paying for with general fund dollars. And there were some that were eliminated because we ended up not hiring into that position. And then we realized that maybe it's not actually a need now that we know that the recovery is going okay. And so, yeah, we have a detailed on our website, and I can't remember which budget hub it's on our website, and we can find out information and send it to you after, that lists out how Salt Lake City spent those dollars, because we're out of them, and it definitely it made us very cash rich, but it's that one-time versus ongoing money thing that we talked about. It's one-time money, and so we had to be deliberate and forward-thinking enough to know that when that one-time money runs out, unless we want to lay off police officers, we need to have a plan for the general fund to pick up those dollars. And so I think our finance department is one of the best in the state, and they have sort of systematically built that into the budget over the last 2 years so that it wasn't such a shock to the system this year when the dollars totally ran out. So yeah, to answer your question, I think a lot of governments that did not have that deliberative approach are really struggling with how to make up for those dollars. We also did a lot of projects with those dollars. So like specific housing projects where it's like almost like a one-time project instead of an ongoing program. So.
In one of your slides, I thought it said about 100 million was made for the police department. And then I think you said now it's 90 million. So out of that 90 million, is that really beneficial to be paying police officers to be putting rocks where homeless sleep, is there really nothing more that they can do or we can do from a $90 million budget to be helping the homeless besides putting rocks and taking away their belongings? Is there nothing more that could be done?
I think that one thing that's important to note is that the homelessness response is not funded. In fact, I don't know if any of it is technically funded in the police department. Most of it is actually housed in either the mayor's office or in community and neighborhoods department. And those budgets have been steadily increasing, I think, especially in fact, we added in the budget amendment, we added $1.5 million for the temporary shelter community in this last year. And that would be in the non-departmental budget. So that's in that non-department budget. That's the largest part of it. So one thing that I think that in the coming years we could do better as a city is to more transparently account for where we spend money on homeless services, because I think it's spread throughout the entire city. It's not just in one department or another. I think the administration would also say that they're engaging at all levels of government, because recognizing that it can't just be a city budget issue, that there are systems that are not the purview of the city, like the mental health system, which is the county receives funding for mental health services for the community, and the state that receives funding from Medicaid. And so there are several funding sources that are maybe not as well tapped as they could be to help with the overall ecosystem, where the city can't just always, the city can't fill it alone. So I think that that's what the mayor and council members have been actively engaged during the state legislative session to encourage the state to fund, the state and county to fund as much as possible. But yes, there's more to do, for sure.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is, what sort of information is shared between the city and the county assessor to determine that new development grows to the baseline? I got the sense that you expressed that the assessment might not be accurate. Is there a lack of information?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and sometimes frustrating process, because it's a very compressed process. The time period that the assessor has from when the assessments go out on January 1 to get to the state tax commission, and so they have a very short time to turn around their information. We send them all the information we have, especially in RDA areas where that new growth, that incremental value is key to everything the RDA does, right? And if the assessor comes in at 10% lower than what the RDA staff were projecting based on what they knew that development spent on their development, that can affect future RDA budget years. It's a continually improving process. The state law does not require the assessor to factor in our information at all. So the assessor operates very independently from cities, which may be good, right? Maybe that's the way it should be, because it should be an independent look at what that property is valued at, not necessarily what the city wants to get from it. But it's interesting, I guess, is is the best way I could observe it. And there's definitely room for improvement. I think it's much better than it has been in years past, I think, because of the electronic sharing of information. I think actually the assessor, especially for commercial properties, relies heavily on the property owner, which actually gives the property owner some autonomy in terms of what they're willing to share. I think some property owners are not willing to share, their lease rates and things like that, which they have their own reasons for that. And yeah, so it is I think that's probably one area of the system where if we could tweak the improvements just a little bit, it would be nice. But yeah.
Thank you. Why should my property tax, why should my taxes increase to pay for someone's National Hockey League NHL game ticket? Bill 207 passed in Utah State Legislature allows Salt Lake City to increase state sales tax 1.5% from 7.75 to 8.25% for 30 years. Representatives within our city government should be appalled not excited, but suggested city sales tax increase paid to develop a revitalized zone hockey team. The hockey team's cost should be reflected in the cost of a ticket and borne by the attendees from the entire state. All Salt Lake City residents should not be forced to pay for the cost of a hockey fan's ticket through a sales tax increase for 30 years. Comment. Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, I think what we'll probably do is just share that comment with council members. They haven't considered that tax yet. Just to clarify, it would be a citywide tax, and it would go towards the revitalization area, which is both for hockey and keeping the Jazz downtown. So that's all I can say, but thank you for your comment, and we'll pass that along.
A related question, what strategies or methods of rear-facing accountability goes into the budget every year? Just what, like transparency, is there a detailed budget report on how the money was spent, decision making on what programs or projects may be working or not working, and then adjusting the budget accordingly?
That's a great question, and I think that is actually, I think, what the council views as like their main role in the city is how was the money spent? Are the things working that we thought were going to work? How should we change the budget based on evaluating if those things are working? And so that is why we do this budget process every year. There's definitely not enough time to do as deep of a dive into everything as we wish there was. And so you'll see, I mentioned the staff reports earlier. So every department gets a staff report from our city council office that is not employed by the mayor, that we don't report to the mayor, we don't report to the department, we report to the city council. So I like to think of it as a little bit more of an objective. Sometimes we ask questions that are uncomfortable for the departments to answer. And sometimes we ask for metrics that aren't there, or the metrics aren't quite achieving what they talked about in the previous budget year. And so we'll highlight that in our staff report, and then the council will frequently use that as a discussion point in their public discussion for that department. So if you're interested in a specific department, I highly recommend looking at the budget schedule and tuning in when we talk about that department. There are times where the council is maybe has a little trepidation about continuing to fund a program because there's maybe not the metrics, but they don't want to shut down the program prematurely. And so then they'll adopt something called the legislative intent, which is basically like saying, we want to look into this more over the course of the next year. So we didn't have enough time to crack this nut in the 6 weeks we were looking at the budget, but we're not willing to just sort of say, everything's great, just keep going. So there are several of those, and actually on the May 7th council meeting, we're going to have a year looking back debrief on the legislative intents from last year. So that kind of sets us up for our budget discussions for the coming year, is sort of reminding the council, what were the things that were kind of giving you pause in this last year? And the administration helps us answer those, right? Like they know what the questions are, and so it's their opportunity to say, here's why we don't have the metrics. Maybe it's just that the program got started on July 1, but we didn't end up hiring anyone until, January 1, and, the storms, and who knows. And, there's all kinds of extenuating circumstances, and that's fine. But it's that intentional public discussion of, are we going to have those metrics, and when, and what are they, that I think is key to what the council does with the budget. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a few questions, but I won't take up all the time. So you said there's a period during the process when you're trying to approve the budget from the beginning of the year to June that you have a lot of conversations with the administration. And I'm curious how those, well, two parts. I'm curious how those conversations go. Do you find that you're generally aligned with the administration, or do you find you guys are mostly in contrast? And then also I forgot the second part, but we'll stick with that first.
Okay. I think that's a great question. In the almost 20 years I've worked for the city, I can say that we've had both experiences where the council is fully aligned with the administration and it feels like you're preaching to a choir, right? And then there are other times where it feels like the council is maybe holding a line that they feel like the administration is not, or the council's interested in looking at the budget in a way that's entirely different from the way the administration is looking at it. And that's, I think, the form of government we're in. It's the mayor-council form of government, and they're co-equal branches of government. And I've been in a situation where the mayor proposed a budget, the council disagreed and changed the budget, and the mayor vetoed the budget. Then the council overrode the mayor's veto. So it's kind of like a tennis game that is a lot of work, and is my gray hair is because of it. But it's the role of the government. So I think as it relates to this administration, I think the council and this administration are very well aligned in terms of general goals and policies. It's always the details, though, that trip up. Even friends who agree on things get tripped up on details, right? So that's why it's always interesting to see when the mayor actually submits the annual budget and the detailed line items in the annual budget, to find out where, council members who might agree with her on 99.9% of things might say one line item and be like, no, or yes, but only if I understand it to be this way, So those are part of the conversations in May too.
Thank you for your work, and I know that I've watched you over the TV quite a bit, so I know you know numbers. My question is that the citizens of Salt Lake vote for bonds, and after the bonds are expired, the Salt Lake Council and Mayor turn around and take that bond money that we did and turn around and just flip it into something else that they want to do. Is there a way that we can stop this kind of a process based on the fact that I know that the Delta Center, we paid for 30 years on the Delta Center, and then they just turn that bond over again and put it back into the renovations of the current Delta Center's expansion. Now they're going to charge us up to 5.5% on an additional taxing for another expansion on the Delta Center. How is this budget, where do the citizens have a say in this budget? And I don't just mean by the city council. We should be able to vote every time a bond has expired to renew the bond or not.
That is a great question. I think that, I guess my initial response would be, the way citizens can get involved is anytime there is a legislative action, make sure you're going to those public hearings and voicing your opinions. So as it relates to the sales tax, the council is going to have a public hearing. And I think we'll be talking about the timeline more on May 7th. But I believe there will be a public hearing for this downtown revitalization area on May 21st. So put that on your calendar, come testify. And then as it relates to issuing bonds after voters have approved. So the technical logistical element is that there are different kinds of bonds. So not all bonds are approved by voters. So GO bonds, general obligation bonds, are approved by voters. Sales tax bonds and local building authority bonds are not. Those can just be issued by the local elected body. And so I think the other way that you can make your voice heard is to pay attention for when the council is considering issuing bonds and coming and testifying about that. I think that it's kind of rare for bonds to expire. In my experience, it's just been, there have been a handful, but it is kind of rare because they're usually 25 or 30-year periods. So it doesn't happen that often, but the city has an excellent bond rating. And it is, from a financial perspective, it doesn't always make sense to save up cash to pay for a large project when you can get, especially in these interest rate times, when you can get 2 or 3% interest rate to build a project upfront. So that's the consideration that the council often weighs in terms of, now that's totally separate from the Delta Center expansion. That's just general bonding. The city council, in fact, last year issued a sales tax bond for parks and public lands. And so that always has a public hearing attached to it. I guess the other thing I could suggest is to contact your state representative, because all of our bonding authority is governed by the state, and there are frequently conversations at the state level about what cities should and shouldn't be able to do in terms of bonds. I will say that the attitude at the state legislature is a little different now that interest rates are higher and developers want to access those public bond markets. So that has been an interesting shift. But yeah, so I think those are the three ways I would suggest you could get involved and influence decisions. I don't know if that answered your question. Sorry, it was probably didn't. Sorry.
Sort of a follow-up on that. With the legislature approval for the redevelopment, I know the city council has to approve it, but does then that create like a new silo that who and how will the decisions be made with that money?
That's a great question. And actually, because this tool that the legislature created is literally the first and we've never seen a tool like this before. We're still unwinding some of that with the city attorney's office and the state tax commission. As I understand it, the state tax commission will still remit all that money to the city, but the city is limited in terms of where we can give that, what we can do with that money. We can only, by state law, give that money to purposes within that capital reinvestment zone. So we could not say, allocate some of that money to like Liberty Park or to Glendale. We are trying to figure out the wiggle room that we have in terms of things that help that reinvestment zone, like investing in public safety, investing in homeless services, if that's an allowable use of that money. I would say that we're still in early days on that, and so I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not an attorney or with the tax commission, so a lot of it is waiting for sort of their analysis of the law, especially since it's kind of we're in a new uncharted kind of territory on it. But as I understand it now, that money will come through the city, so technically it will be appropriated by the city council. But because we're limited by state law in terms of how we can spend it, it will create its own silo in a way that we are limited to this one purpose to using it that way. Yeah.
I just, I don't know if it's maybe because I'm new to the city or new to these budget hearings, but the airport budget seems to be like super large, and I just wondering why is it that isn't so big compared to like everything else?
Yeah. I guess the short answer is that we're still paying for construction projects at the airport. And because of the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA rules, the airport has to budget for let's say a construction project might take 10 years for the airport to build. They have to budget for it all in a single budget year. So this year, the airport budget is $500 million. 2 years ago, when Concourse B, the second concourse out, was being budgeted, that year it was closer to $2 billion just for the airport. So it has this wild swing because we're undergoing such a massive construction project. So much of the construction project is funded with grants, though, that it doesn't end up affecting the city's bond rating or the general fund's cash balance. They do literally have that cash sitting there, and then sometimes they will bond for it just to maximize the value of their cash. But that is essentially why I would say let's tune in. And also it's grown in size. I mean, that's just the truth too, is that we have way more gates, way more passengers than we did when it was the old Salt Lake City airport. But I am interested in like when the construction is over, although I think depending on what you ask the airport director, it will probably continue on in perpetuity. Maybe the airport budget shrinks to like 75% of what that, and don't quote me on that, but I would bet that it will be less because we won't have these giant construction projects on the budget rolls. So
I heard you say something about the temporary shelter for unsheltered populations, and wondering, and forgive me if this does not pertain if it's states, but wondering where did that budget come from, and if there's a thought for it to happen again, and where will that budget come from?
That's a great question. The initial funding for the temporary shelter community was added to the budget in the fiscal year 24 cycle. It was a council initiative. The council found money essentially from our rainy day fund. So our fund balance, because of what I was talking about before, how we were very cautious in how we were budgeting our sales tax growth. You know, we guessed that we would get 4% growth in sales tax, and we actually got 10%. So that means that extra 6% got dropped into our savings account instead of used in our general fund. So we did have a healthy rainy day fund. So the council used that to fund the initial 500,000. And then when it became clear that that money would probably fall short in having that shelter community be what I think the council was envisioning it to be, which was a well-operated shelter community and not just sort of a put-together one, they added another $1 million from that same savings account as a what we call a temporary holding account. So in fact, we're just considering it as part of this next budget amendment, is using money from that $1 million holding account to essentially not finish out the shelter community, but pay for the shelter community's operations for the rest of the fiscal year. I think that because the shelter community will now be operating through the summer, you may see an additional amount either in the annual budget or requested from that temporary holding account, assuming we haven't spent the whole thing. I think this is one of those push and pulls because typically the city, Salt Lake City Corporation, would not be the operator would not pay to operate a shelter community. Typically that would fall to the state or the county because that is where those funding they receive funding for homelessness operations, homelessness services, mental health, Medicaid, that kind of thing. But I think the council was responding to a lack of funding at those government levels and felt compelled to step in. So from the governance standpoint, they viewed it as a one-time expense because I think they were hoping that over the course of this year, they would be able to demonstrate to the state leaders that this is a good thing, that this is helping people and that this is a worthy expenditure and that the state would step in. And so the state is in the process of establishing what we're calling a permanent temporary shelter community, like a more long-lasting temporary shelter community, but the details on that are still being worked out as I understand it. So I guess most of the budget team in Salt Lake City is anticipating that we will want to have that shelter community operating, even if it's not in that location, somewhere for a longer period of time, and that may mean that the city finds money for that in partnership with the county and the state. And obviously we always hope that the county and the state will step up and fund more. So yeah, I guess the short answer is the savings account. I could have answered that more short.
I'm honestly still thinking about the county assessor because that's under the pain.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there's any measures right now or projects by the city to try to bridge that gap between their assessment and you guys think should be, is it in the interest of the assessor to bridge that gap? What's going on there?
Yeah. The RDA staff especially, has been actively working on it for years, and I think have had mixed results depending on staff in the assessor's office and bandwidth in the assessor, meaning like workload in the assessor's office, and so they are actively working on it. I don't know that the assessor is not funded from any of these activities, right? Like they have a direct property tax allocation for their purposes. And so it doesn't really matter to them if, properties are valued accurately. Obviously, I think just from a professional standpoint, they probably want them to be valued accurately, but I think the definition of accurate depends, right, on who you ask. And there are some property owners who I think fight for their assessments to be lower than they know they should be because they don't want to pay as much. So, which, that's their right. So, yeah, it is a good project though, long term.
So following up on his question a little bit, and in general, I heard you talk about a couple of bottlenecks that you feel like were like restricting your ability maybe to meet the needs of the population. But I'm curious if you could elaborate on that a little bit more about what you feel like maybe in the system or in terms of the resources we have available is restricting your ability to meet maybe more raw areas of the budget, or if there are raw areas of the budget, or if we're operating in like the green zone, if that makes sense. I'm kind of curious about how that process is like, where it's rough and where it's smooth.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I have to say, in watching our, watching the finance team's internal deliberations and seeing how intentional our local electeds are, both on the mayor and council side. I think that the budgets we end up with are often, it's that sausage making process where it's really ugly during the process, but it ends up with probably the best that could be expected, given all of the pressures, right? Because if you just said, we just want to address everyone's needs, then property taxes would probably be too high for people to afford, right? So there's that pressure too. And because we, the city can't just raise sales taxes to tax visitors to Salt Lake City, we have to rely on property taxes and fines and fees and things like that. And so it's not a perfect process, but I think it's pretty good in terms of, because we have these co-equal branches that have to negotiate and value each other's various priorities. I think that you end up with a pretty decent product at the end, even with the improvements that need to come every year. I think if I had one thing to improve, I would say it would be greater local autonomy. It would be awesome if the cities could decide, if they would rather lower the sales tax and have a little bit of the income tax, or, and maybe that would mean lower property taxes. But that's probably not tenable in our state elected environment, in our state legislative environment. So we just work within the system that we have and try to make it the best we can.